Welcome to this Queen's Jubilee event celebrating the Platinum Jubilee a little early ahead of Sunday the 6th. And this is the first major Telegraph event that we're doing on the Queen's momentous reign, 7 decades. I don't quite know how we're going to cram in all of your amazing questions, my questions, and everything we want to discuss about this remarkable era. We're not just going to be looking at the Queen as an individual and equally about some of the highlights of the last 7 decades, but looking forward and looking at what her legacy might be. And some of you have also asked some questions about how best to celebrate the Jubilee. So we'll be tackling all of those in the next 45 minutes. I have a feeling we might overrun. We're absolutely delighted with how many people have signed up for this event, nearly 1,000, and you're all clocking up now. I can see hundreds of you, and thank you for all saying hi. I'm Camilla Tominey. I'm the Associate Editor of The Telegraph. I cover politics and, of course, royals for the newspaper. I must say this is one of the events I've been most excited about doing because I am quite genuinely intrigued to hear our 2 guests answer some of the questions that you've put to them tonight. I'd like to introduce my first guest, royal expert Penny Junor. Now, Penny has been reporting on the royals for more than 35 years. She's written some of the most definitive books on the royal family. She continues to go from strength to strength, and we're going to benefit hugely from her royal wisdom. So I'd like to introduce Penny to the stage now. Hello, Penny.
Hi.
Hello. Thank you for joining
everyone.
us. Thank you very much. And I'd also like to introduce the leading historian, Suzannah Lipscomb. Now, Susanna, again, needs no introduction. She's done many documentaries, written many books, and has got a particular focus on royal history. So let's welcome her to the stage now. Susanna, thanks so much for joining us.
Hello, thank you.
Wonderful to be here. I'm loving the fact that this is an all-girl power panel. We're like the Spice Girls of the royal scene, kind of. And let's get things started. So the topic of today's debate is not just the Queen's reign, but also the legacy of her Elizabethan era, the Second Elizabethan Era. So let's kick off. I'll ask you, Penny, first. How do you think history is going to define this Elizabethan era?
Well, I think this era has actually seen perhaps more change. I mean, Susanna would know better, she's the historian, but more change than any other era, or certainly reign, any other reign. You know, if you think about, if somebody who was alive in 1952 remembered back to that and looked at society and the world we live in today, they wouldn't recognize it. I mean, I was alive in 1952, and I don't recognize it. It has changed hugely. We've got technology, we've got scientific change, we've got, I mean, you know, look at the way we've handled this pandemic. That could never have happened 70 years ago. Everything has changed. Society has changed. When the Queen came to the throne in 1952, divorcees were not welcomed at court. Today, 3 of the Queen's children are divorced, and the eldest, who will be king, is divorced and has married a divorcee. I mean, that would never, ever have happened 52 years ago.
So it's interesting, isn't it, Penny, that actually, while everything has changed beyond all recognition during her reign, the one constant has been the Queen herself. Susanna,
Precisely.
Is there any particular sort of quintessential thing? We can think back to Queen Victoria's reign, which is probably the closest comparison, really, and think about the Aspidistra or the Great Exhibition as something that is quintessentially of that time. Is there anything quintessentially of the Second Elizabethan era that you can think of?
I think we might point to the Queen's relationship with television, because she was the first monarch, of course, to have her coronation televised, and half the adult population tuned in to watch it. And it's after that that we see, and with the funeral perhaps before that, but that we see that, you know, television ownership jump. And of course, she was the first monarch to appear on television to give her annual Christmas message. And actually, I think it is her Christmas message that we can look to, where we say we don't know that much about her, we don't know her heart, but she gives us insights every year, and she tells us about her faith, and she tells us about her positivity. She's always talking about hope and forgiveness and, you know, peacemaking and reconciliation. And there are some lovely glimpses one's had over the years. There was one moment in the footage surrounding one speech where she was chatting with the royal children about the corgis, and the corgi called dash. And she said, you know, the word you say when you're cross. And of course, most of us say very different words. But but the other thing, of course, the other side of that is that she's also the monarch who's been parodied and caricatured on television. Spitting Image in the 1980s and revived recently, but also, of course, we think of the Queen and we think of the Crown. And so she's come face to face, as it were, with this version of her, which at least must misrepresent her, sometimes must malign her. And, you know, I think of the courage and the steely nerve it must take to hear that and never reply. So I think that sort of sums up the era. We've had her character come through in her television appearances, but we've also seen the ways that she has been pilloried.
Is that right, Penny? Because I sometimes feel that she's obviously the world's most famous and most photographed and most travelled woman, and yet she remains an enigma. People regard her as the person on the stamps and the coins, and yet when you meet her in real life, and I can personally testify to this, she's very smiley, very sparkly, and in a way much more mischievous than you might think. She's got a great sense of humour as well, hasn't she? Sometimes she's just kept that buried, though. Why do you think that is? Through necessity, Penny?
Well, I think she's played a blinder, really, in the way she has been on the throne, the way she has ruled. I mean, we all know that strong personalities cause division. You know, some people love them, some people don't. And what the Queen has done, I think, is present a very bland front to the world. And that means that, you know, people may disagree with the monarchy. They may dislike the monarchy, but I don't think there are many people who actually dislike the Queen. She's not enough of a strong personality to dislike, or the one that she presents to the world. But privately, of course, as you say, she's delightful. She's got a great sense of humour. She's a great mimic. You know, she loves dancing. She's a very interesting and interested woman. But I think that it's been a real formula for success that people don't really know what. I mean, and of course, you know, she can't talk about politics. She can't be seen to be raising an eyebrow when, you know, when something happens, or a slight smile. She has to be absolutely neutral. And she's done that to perfection.
I mean, is there a sense that she has been so successful because this non-partisanship, which has been resolute and actually noticeably so compared to her son and heir, I appreciate he's in a different position as heir apparent, that people have looked to her, that she has transcended politics and therefore she's a trusted figure. But also, I was going to say, Susanna, when we looked at some of her highlights, she has listened to the public, hasn't she? I mean, I would cite the Diana televised address as extraordinary in many ways, because actually if you tried to get a politician to do that, or somebody else who had to win an election, they'd probably have agonized over it. And yet she sensed that she wasn't with her public, and she adapted her behavior and made things right.
Yes, that's really interesting, because that's one of the occasions on which she's most criticized. And as you say, she did address it, and then, you know, she's been criticized for failing to act more quickly. But she did then give that address. And then, of course, the other thing that comes to mind is the Aberfan disaster, you know, the pit heap collapse in South Wales in 1966. And at the time, she held back for 6 days not to interrupt the rescue, but that has been caricatured as, you know, not caring. But even the reports that come out from that say that the people who were there was a woman called Mrs. Beatrice Williams who'd lost 7 people in the disaster, and the Queen visited her, and afterwards Mrs. Williams said she was charming. She was she was really upset. She was down to earth. She was, you know, the most charming person she'd ever met. And so there's a way in which, even when things happen which are characterized as being failures on her part, and I don't think they are actually failures, but when they're characterized as that, then there is action afterwards which seems to redeem the occasion. So I do feel I do think that she does listen, and I do think that she cares. I think she really cares about doing the right thing, and she cares about people, and that comes across to those who meet her.
Penny, I mean, obviously we're here to celebrate her reign. What would you say have been some of the highlights, and what have actually been some of the lowlights? What have been the occasions where she hasn't got it quite right, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think Susanna's absolutely right. You know, when Diana died, I think she got it wrong then. I think during that week, she was actually more concerned about her grieving grandsons than she was about the country. And I mean, the interesting thing about the monarchy really is the Queen is represents the country to itself. You know, so when we are grieving as a nation, we want the Queen, the monarch, to express that grief for us. And when we're celebrating, again, we want the monarch there to express our joy. And I think that the Queen on that occasion failed to see that role of hers was almost more important for the nation than her private role as grandmother to the boys. And I think she was in a very, very difficult situation during that week. And I think that on balance, she got it wrong. Perhaps not for the boys, but she certainly did for the country, because of course the media were baying for her. You know, they were saying, "Where are you, ma'am?" And don't you care? And, you know, and of course she cared. But so I think that was one of her low spots. But then, of course, she redeemed herself just by going onto television and addressing the nation and saying exactly what she felt. She spoke from the heart. She spoke about how wonderful Diana had been, what an inspiration to people, and understood people's grief for this extraordinary girl, you know, but that she had been, you know, grieving. Everybody grieves in a different way, and they had been grieving privately at Balmoral. So she did rescue herself from that. As for high spot,
yeah, sorry, high spot, please. Yes, please, Penny.
Sorry, because you did ask for one. As for high spots, I think I would say that, I mean, it's a very trivial one in some ways, but when she went along with that James Bond spoof at the London Olympics, I just thought that was magic. You know, I mean, I talked about the Queen presenting this very neutral face to the world. Well, then, you know, on that occasion, she didn't. She let a little bit of her mischievousness out. And I thought that given her age and stage in her reign, and given the event, you know, this fantastic hosting of the Olympic Games was just perfect. And she did it so beautifully.
She did too. Susanna, I mean, do you agree with that, or would you pick something more historic? Do you think there have been particular historic highs and lows?
Well, there certainly have been moments where she has shaped history or made history. Many of her visits, whether it's going to Germany in 1965, you know, 20 years after the war had ended, or going to Russia after the Cold War ended. So there are many occasions on which her visits themselves have made history. I mean, the other one that's very obvious, I suppose, is in 2011, her visit to the Republic of Ireland, the first time that a British monarch had been on Irish soil since 1911, for a century. And the Queen wore emerald green. And when she gave a speech at a state dinner, she spoke in Gaelic, and she shook hands with Martin McGuinness of the IRA. And David Cameron said of that handshake, it was the most transformative bit of diplomacy he'd ever seen. So there are these moments when the Queen is the soft power of this country and does transform things by her very presence. So, you know, those have been some of the historic highlights. And there are so many, actually. I mean, I could point to so many occasions where she's been somewhere and it's changed something. And actually, I'll tell you the one little, this is a completely sort of sidebar little thing, but one particular moment I think that is characteristic of her, and speaks to how she is the rest of the time, which is something that she said to Sir John Key, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, who asked her why she wore formal address, even on occasions when she wasn't in front of the crowds or the cameras. And she said, "I am the last bastion of standards." And I think that I think that speaks to her character.
You know, I would say she doesn't.
Go on, Penny.
I would say she doesn't always wear incredibly smart clothes. Have you ever seen photographs of her when she's been out with her dogs on a day's shoot? She looks like a bag lady. She's got on waterproofs and I swear to God, she does. She looks extraordinary. She does not look like your monarch. But you know, that is when she's completely off duty with her gun dogs, and she's working them, and she is out there with other gun dog enthusiasts. And I mean, it's something that it's a side of the Queen that I think not many people know a huge amount about. But she has been, over the years, one of the most experienced and best breeders of gun dogs in the country. She's got kennels at Sandringham. I mean, we all think of her as having those corgis and the dorgies, which of course she has had, you know, throughout her reign. But gun dogs are also a speciality, and she absolutely loves going out onto the moors, you know, Balmoral, Sandringham, dressed up in this, you know, all-weather gear with Wellington boots on, and and a sort of thing pulled over her head. You would mistake her for a bag lady.
I was going to ask on that note, what job do you think she would have done had she not been Queen? Because I think there was a report once that she herself had commented that she would have quite happily sort of ran a horse training stables and an estate of some sort. Would you agree with that, Penny?
Sorry, I missed the beginning of that. I think you froze for a moment.
What job might she have done? Sorry, what job might she have done if she wasn't Queen?
Well, I mean, she always said that what she would like to be, she told her governess when she was a child, that when she grew up, she wanted to be a country lady with surrounded by horses and dogs. So, and I think that is actually what she would have done. You know, she's not a very outgoing sort of person, naturally. She's quite shy, she's quite reserved. She loves, I mean, she totally comes alive in the countryside and totally comes alive in the presence of either horses or dogs. And I think that the dogs particularly have you know, been her saviour throughout all these years. They're known, I mean, her family talk about them as the dog mechanism. When she's in a tricky spot, she turns to the dogs. And she, you know, there are many times where somebody has been completely tongue-tied on meeting the Queen or on having lunch with her or something, and she'll get them to talk to the dogs. I mean, there's a famous occasion where John Knott, the surgeon, do you know who I mean? Who yes. For years he's worked in this country, and then he goes out to war you know, war hotspots, and the Queen he was just back from Aleppo, and the Queen invited him to lunch. It was quite a small lunch, and he was sitting next to her, and as was her wont, she addressed the person on her right for the first couple of courses, and then she turned to him and she said, "I hear you've just come back from Aleppo." And he said, suddenly, he couldn't speak. You know, suddenly all that he'd seen, I mean, he said he was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, but he stared at the wall and he just couldn't answer her question. And she very quickly realized something was wrong. And she called a footman and said, "Bring the dogs." And the dogs came in, and she said, "Get the food." And he brought a biscuit barrel. And she said, "Shall we talk to the dogs? Or shall we, you know, shall we feed the dogs? Shall we feed the dogs?" And she took a biscuit and she handed it to him. And they both kind of looked down and talked to the dogs about the dogs, sort of under the table. And he said it was the most humane thing he had ever experienced. And when he left and people said, you know, how was your lunch? They just couldn't believe what he said he'd done and talked about.
Yeah. I mean, she is very human. I'm just reading some of these comments now. Renee, you are right to say that your understanding is she wears bright colours to be easily seen. Yes, her motto is, I need to be seen to be believed. That's why even if she has an umbrella, it's see-through, because she figures whenever anyone sees her, they're going to remember it for the rest of their life. So she has to be in Technicolor, so she stands out from a crowd. Kirsten says, I loved it recently when she cut a cake with a sword and the lady pointed out the knife and she said, I know there is. This is just more unusual. So she had a sense of fun. She wanted to try and cut that cake with that sword. I was going to ask you before we move on, just talking about her a bit more as a woman, as opposed to as a head of state. Susanna, obviously we can go back to 1952, but recent history, and I'm talking about the last 2 years, have been quite significant for the Queen's reign. First of all, the We'll Meet Again speech, but also her handling of two extremely difficult periods with Megxit and then, of course, the Duke of York. Do you think we've learned more about the Queen at 95 than we might have known before? What have you learned about her in her handling of these three big events that have overshadowed certainly royal life for the last 2 years?
That's really interesting, because also there's a sense I feel that some of the ways in which these have been handled isn't just the Queen, but is also the influence of Prince Charles. So it's quite hard to distinguish the two. And, you know, Prince Charles has made it clear that he wants to streamline the monarchy in the future. And so I think some of the impetus, even for the treatment of his son, but certainly for the treatment of his brother, has come from him as well as the Queen. So I'm not sure if it does give us an insight into the Queen, but if it does, or at least if she's agreed these things, then what we see is, I suppose, a decisiveness. In some cases, I think some evidence of integrity. In other cases, what feels to be a little hard-nosed in terms of an approach. And I mean, I think it's, you know, Prince Harry and the Duchess of Sussex made clear that any racist comments that were made weren't made by the Queen or the Duke of Edinburgh. So I don't think it tells us that. But I think it does show her protection in the end of the institution, of the family. And I suppose that shouldn't come as a surprise. I mean, she's always been duty first and self second. And in fact, that's what I find interesting about the discussion we've just had about how she responded after Diana's death, because it isn't characteristic, I don't think, of her to put even family before duty. No. I think of the fact that 4 days after the Duke of Edinburgh's death, she was back at work, and so so that seems quite characteristic to me. And the handling of the Diana episode is sorry, that episode sounds so disparaging, but her response to that tragedy, I think, it doesn't sound characteristic.
But then, Penny, how personally pained do you think she has been by Megxit and the Duke of York's now not just stepping back from public life, but as far as I can tell, complete removal from public life? I don't think he's ever going to return. We have this impression of this woman who is able to compartmentalize, but as a granny and as a mother, these two moments in her life must have been devastating for her.
I think that's absolutely right, and I'm sure that she did need a bit of prompting from Prince Charles and probably William as well, to take the firm hand that she did. But, you know, as Susanna says, she has always put the monarchy ahead of everything else. You know, when she had her small children, they suffered, I think, because of that. I think she was a new queen and she had young children and she was learning the ropes. But I think she paid more attention to learning the ropes of being on the throne rather than the ropes of being a new mother. So I think this has been very difficult for her. She is a very, very doting grandmother, and also a very doting mother. And you know, I think I was particularly struck by when the Prince Andrew, well, immediately after the Emily Maitlis Newsnight interview, which was such a disaster, and it was clear at that point, that this couldn't go on, that Andrew had made a real mess of this. And I think it was Prince Charles who forced the Queen's hand there and said, he must step back from public duties. And so she agreed with that, and he did step back. But the very next day, after announcing all of this, she was seen riding with him in Windsor Great Park, riding with Andrew. And I think that was a very clear message that, my son has screwed up. I mean, with the interview, I don't mean in the bigger picture. He failed dismally in that interview to express sympathy or regret or anything. But nonetheless, she's still the son that she loves. And with Harry and Meghan, again, I think, they were potentially huge assets for the monarchy. But they said they wanted to go, and they said actually they'd like to half go and half be still here and representing the Queen. And she said, no, it's one or the other. And was firm about that. And I think that was absolutely the right decision to have made. Because look, I mean, had she allowed it, they might very well have this $18 million contract with Netflix, now, while with the other half of their life being representatives of the Queen. And that would have been very, very uncomfortable. I mean, it's uncomfortable as it is with the Paul Rogan stuff going on. It becomes messy and dangerous for the monarchy.
On that note, quite a few people have asked whether either the Duke of York or indeed the Duke of Sussex will ever be stripped of their dukedoms. And Susanna, my view has always been absolutely not, because there's no historical precedent for that. Even when Edward VIII abdicated, I think there was a moment where a BBC general said, should we refer to him as Mr. Edward Windsor? And George VI said, absolutely not. And he had his dukedoms taken away, but then replaced with the Duke of Windsor the very next day. So this idea of them being stripped of their dukedoms, I just think is a fantasy and a fallacy, isn't it, Susanna?
Yes, it doesn't make sense historically speaking. I mean, the dukedoms of Sussex and York are traditionally associated with the royal family, just as Edinburgh and Cornwall are. And so it is highly unlikely they're going to be taken away. I mean, Edward VIII had to abdicate in order to lose his, and as you say, had a new one created for him thereafter, deliberately not associated with any of the traditional royal titles. But I don't think that's going to be the case. I think that what we've seen is the removal of these titles is a clear indication that there's a distancing, that Prince Harry and Prince Andrew no longer represent the Queen. And that's what has happened with the sort of removal of the military titles and the royal patronages. But I think their dukedoms are, to use a big word, ontological. They're kind of part of who they are, as far as the Queen would see it. They're part of their being that they were born into. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I can't quite see what would happen. Would it possibly happen if Prince Andrew ended up in jail? I don't know. The Queen doesn't like those who break the law, that's for sure. But I think that they are essentially part of who they are.
Penny?
I was just going to say, I mean, why strip them of them? Harry and Meghan have done nothing wrong. They decided they didn't want to be working members of the family. That's fine. I mean, they may have made a few, lobbed a few hand grenades back at the family since leaving, but that's not criminal. And let's face it, Prince Andrew at the moment is innocent until proved guilty. I mean, he made a huge blunder, in my view, with the Emily Maitlis interview, because he failed to empathize with those girls and failed to regret his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. But, at the moment, we don't know. He maintains his innocence. And until a jury, or a judge finds him guilty, I think we shouldn't even be thinking about stripping him of his dukedom.
Petra's just asking, is Harry still an HRH? I'll answer that briefly. Yes, he is, but he's not allowed to use the style over in America, and therefore it sort of becomes redundant, although he is still the Duke and Duchess of, they're still the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Strangely, Meghan calls herself Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, which is actually kind of wrong because that implies that she's either divorced or indeed widowed, but that's the style she prefers. And equally with the Duke of York, he is told he can no longer use his HRH style officially, therefore it becomes redundant, but I suppose privately he still could, to answer that question. We're going to get on to succession in just a moment, of course, respectfully, because there's a lot of questions about, effectively along the theme of how does Prince Charles fill these enormous shoes. But before that, Penny, and with a degree of sensitivity, because a lot of people have asked this, how do you think the Queen's health is? Because she's obviously had her moment in hospital towards the end of last year and people are worried. I always felt it was more mobility related than health related, but just briefly.
I have no inside knowledge at all, and you probably more than me, but my view, optimistically, is that she had been behaving like a 75-year-old and her body was suddenly telling her, actually, you are 95. You know, I mean, you know as well as I do, because you've been to these receptions and things and events and days out with her. But they are exhausting, absolutely exhausting. She's the center of attention. She has to remember so many names. She has to make the right conversation. And rightly, you know, you said people remember every detail about meeting her. So she's on show, and you know, she was going out and doing one event after another, several packed into a week, you know, and I just think it was too much.
Yeah.
And she does it all so well on Zoom that you don't really need the real thing. But I you know, I'm being optimistic, and that's me just hoping.
I agree with you. I agree with you, and I think, you know, they're preserving her energy for this big Platinum Jubilee celebration, equestrian events in May, and then the big bank holiday weekend in June, and we've already had some detail on that, a big thank holiday to thank everybody, big street parties, a concert. So we think as well that it will be a time of national celebration akin to 2012 with the double of the Diamond Jubilee and indeed the Olympics, because after 2 years of hell, we all want to get together as a community and celebrate. So it's well timed. Vivian, I will ask your question now because I got it written down and it's a great question. Who do you think have been her biggest role models? Susanna, do you think that she has derived role models from the royal family, perhaps? I mean, we know she was extremely close to her own father.
Yes, I mean, I would say immediately it's her father above all, but also her mother. From her father, a great sense of service, and from her mother, a great sense of compassion and some of that humour we've been talking about. So actually, I think her parents, and the fact that her father stepped into that role that he didn't want, that he had hoped never to have, expected never to have, was a great example to her. And I think that is sort of at the heart of why she keeps on going. People always often ask questions about why she hasn't abdicated and passed it over to Charles, you know, give him a good innings, etc. But I think she has understood this job to be for life, because the fact that was that her father had to step in when someone else didn't take that attitude. And so I think it's at the core of her being.
Yes. I mean, abdication's always been a dirty word in her vocabulary, Penny.
Oh, absolutely.
And also she's a woman of strong faith. I mean, she took a coronation oath before God. So let's grasp this nettle right now. Will she ever abdicate? Will she ever pass on to Charles? Will there be a Prince Regency? What's your response?
I would say no, unless she lost her mental capacity. But I think, you know, that's highly unlikely. She's as bright as a button. You know, I don't think she will. I mean, I remember one of her private secretaries reading in the news that Queen Margarita, was it, or Juliana, Margarita of Denmark had abdicated. And this private secretary said, ma'am, you know, this is the news this morning. And she just said, typical Dutch. Did I say the Netherlands?
I would.
Yes. No, that's right.
I mean, I think it's unlikely as well. I mean, it is part of the Constitution. It is possible, theoretically. It's been possible since Charles was 18 and a councillor of state, that if she became disabled to such an extent that she couldn't carry out her duties, he could be regent. But it's clear that she's not going to go voluntarily. I mean, there was speculation about whether she would stand down when she was 95, because that is what the Duke of Edinburgh had stepped back from public duties at that age. That birthday came and went, so if it happens, that will be up to her and her doctors, but it seems unlikely that she's going to do that voluntarily.
I agree. Although Pedro sums up the mood on Prince Charles in general with this question: what must Charles do once he exceeds to live up to this extraordinary reign? I.e., there isn't that much confidence that he is going to be able to live up to it. That's the truth of it, Penny.
Do you know, I think that the title very often changes people's perception of the person. I mean, I think you see this in prime ministers, and I think you see it in monarchs. And I think that when he is monarch, when he is king, I think there will be a different perception. I mean, I've studied this man for 40 years. And I think he is an extraordinary man. I think he's a visionary in many ways, and has been over the years. I think he's brave. I think he's compassionate. And I think he will bring all of that to his reign. And I think that with Camilla beside him, who is so very warm and friendly and funny, and I think we will warm to them. I mean, it's going to be a difficult period, and they are huge boots that he's going to have to fill. But I think there is actually genuine affection for him amongst a huge number of people. Yes, there are some people who never forgave him for his marriage failure to Diana. But actually, I think there are more people out there who recognize his qualities and support him. I think it will be fine.
Do you think, yes or no answer, Penny, do you think Camilla will be known as Queen Consort rather than Princess?
I do.
Yeah. And Susanna, I know you're used to looking back, but looking forward, I mean, what is the future of this royal family? Because it is getting slimmed down. And I feel that there's a great deal of pressure now, not just on Charles and Camilla, who, let's be honest, are in their 70s, but of course on the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, and their role and the role of their children is critical, isn't it?
Yes, and I think that will be the focus. I think it will get slimmed down. The focus will be very much on the line of succession. And I mean, I agree with Penny that we're in danger of violently agreeing here, that actually he is an intelligent and cultured and sensitive man, and will, if given a chance, and not having the first year of his reign compared to the 70 plus years of the Queen's reign, he can impress. But the truth of the matter is that it may be a short reign. Women, his mother and his grandmother lived a long time. Women tend to live longer than men. Who knows? I think it's fair to say he's going to succeed in his old age. And so there's a question about the future. I mean, there's all sorts of other questions about whether other countries will become republics like Barbados did, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Australia. There's questions about how we're going to view the monarchy when you've got a man on the throne and can only see men inheriting the throne into the future. It's very different. Much of the character of the Queen's reign has come from her sort of maternal presence. There are all those meetings at the Commonwealth where she would meet every leader of every country up into the 1990s and could sort of quell the most irascible politicians with her calming presence. And that came in part, it's her character, of course, but I'm sure there's something in there about her gender as well. And so I think that's going to change up the perspective on the monarchy. But I think the thing I'd say about Prince Charles is that he has been actually quite forward thinking. He's been ahead of his time when it comes to sort of sustainable agriculture or climate change, a whole range of issues that young people really care about today. And so given half a chance, and I mean by the British population as a whole, and that God willing he has enough time, he could do some real good.
although as Kathy and Birdie both express on here, and I've heard lots of this sort of talk, Kathy says, perhaps Charles should not slim down the monarchy. There seems to be a lot of work and too few royals to go around. And then Birdie makes the point, many charities rely on royal patronage, so I worry about the monarchy being slimmed down. Now, Penny, they have changed their modus operandi, particularly younger royals. It isn't about attending every opening of an envelope. It's about thematic royalty. So you've still got Princess Anne doing her 7, 8, 9, 10 jobs a day, but that's not how William and Kate are doing it. What's going to happen to all of these hundreds of patronages once, and we don't like to think about it, but the Queen goes? The whole way that the royals operate's got to change, because there's just too much work to go around, isn't there?
Yes, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think there's grave danger for the charities that absolutely rely on royal patronage. But you know what the Royal Foundation were talking about when I was researching a book some years ago, but when this foundation was set up, what of Prince William and Prince Harry at that time, what they were suggesting they would do in future is, rather than taking on single patronages of charities that they would then be attached to for the rest of time, and going perhaps to one event for that charity, you know, assuming they had several thousand charities each, one event maybe every 2 years, they decided that they could attach themselves to charities that were having a particular fundraising boost, or I mean, to boost their fundraising, you know. So if it was an anniversary, or they were branching out into something new, or they needed to build a new hospice, or they needed funds for a particular project, then the member of the royal family would dip in and out of these charities. I mean, this is actually what William and Harry did with Help for Heroes. They were never patrons of that charity. Likewise, Walking with the Wounded, you know, where Harry was so amazing in walking to the South Pole with them. So it gave huge prominence and profile to the charity, brought in huge amounts of money, and then when that charity has got the funds it needs for the particular project, then they move on to something else. And I can see that kind of working.
Yes, I agree. Lots of people are asking about Edward and Sophie, the Wessexes. If you want to know more about what they're doing, and they're heavily involved with the Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme now, I did do an interview with them last spring, which is still online. So look that up, because that tells you the whole shebang, and you're all mainly subscribers. And if you're not, register for free or subscribe, and you can read that. I'm conscious of time. We're going to overrun a little bit, because I just want to cram in these crucial questions, and hopefully nobody minds who's watching, so you can get your money's worth, so to speak. Susanna, how do you think the next generations secure her legacy? Because let's face it, it's been this extraordinary, remarkable period akin to the Victorian era. How do the likes of George and Charlotte and Louis and others ensure that they keep the Queen's remarkable legacy alive?
Well, first we've got to decide what we think her legacy is, I suppose. I mean, and I do think, as we alluded to earlier, she has been all things to all people, and I'm not sure that is going to be something that's going to be kept alive. I think it might not be that the British royal family are going to involve themselves in politics, but it does seem that there's potential for them to be more vocal or more present, and we're going to hear more of their voices in the future than we have heard of the Queen's. But I would say that one thing that would be very dear to the Queen's heart, and I don't think this is presumptuous of me to say this, would be sustaining the Commonwealth. That's been really her greatest achievement, and she cares about it so very much. I mean, there were Commonwealth symbols embroidered on her wedding dress, on her coronation dress, sorry. And you know, this has been something that she has absolutely championed and cares deeply about. It talks about all the time. I mean, opening Westminster Abbey to have interfaith gathering every year on Commonwealth Day, the largest interfaith gathering that happens in the UK. The number of visits and trips that she's done to the Commonwealth So I think it will be sustaining that relationship between the UK and the Commonwealth that would really be a way of sustaining her legacy.
But Penny, it's going to be difficult, isn't it? As Meredith asks, is there any hope for a future monarch to be as beloved in the age of social media? And again, somebody else on here, I think it's gone now, but somebody made the point. There's been so much, oh, here we are, Vivian again. Has the media age, with all its immediacy and the lack of personal privacy, peeled away the mystique of monarchy? What's going to come in the future is going to be so different. It's almost like the Queen, because of her as an individual, a woman of World War II, of her own generation, is almost going to be kind of preserved in aspic. But it's going to be a different monarchy for a different time, isn't it, Penny?
I think it is. I mean, my fear for the monarchy actually is security, because I think that it would be perfectly possible to have a monarchy that was not so steeped in mystique, and that was not so held at arm's length. You know, I think William and Kate are very immediate, and they relate very well with people and with their generation and with younger people, and I could see an era where they were actually, I mean, they might live in their smart house, but they might actually live slightly like Scandinavian royals, where they, I mean, the problem is, for the monarchy to survive, it has to be seen to be useful and fulfilling a purpose and not costing the earth, and just to be worthwhile, and for people to be able to relate to it. And I think that if you've got people in glass houses, they're less easy to relate to. William and Kate are very relatable. Camilla is very relatable. Actually, I think Prince Charles is too. But in this day and age, you couldn't actually have a prince, a king, a queen wandering about the streets without massive security. And that seems to me, you know, the world has just, I mean, you know, look back, we began this whole discussion about the change, or I did, about the change that has taken place during the Queen's reign. And security, you know, the danger to to these people's lives is very real today. In 1952, it wasn't. You know,
Yes.
So on the one hand, So on the one hand, I'm sure they would like to be out there meeting people in a very normal sort of way, but their security is telling them, no, you can't do that.
5 more minutes to go, guys. If you have questions, please do get them in on the chat. Let's go to what she'll be remembered for the most. I mean, it's so virtually impossible to characterize, but try if you can, Susanna.
Gosh, okay, yes. So let me pick up on the point that Penny was making earlier about this being an era of change, and you know that we've seen the empire decolonized, and we've seen, to be perfectly honest, a massive decline in Britain's, you know, geopolitical power. We've seen the welfare system and healthcare, and we've joined and we've left Europe, and the British society has been transformed by you know, thousands, millions of immigrants that become a multicultural society, all those things. And as Penny was saying earlier, the Queen has been, and you were saying that our gilt-edged constant, you know, this absolute constant, this anchor in the midst of these seas. I think she'll be remembered for that constancy. I think she'll be remembered, as I've already said, for the Commonwealth. I think she'll be remembered, of course, for the longevity of her reign, that she, you know, she's met, there's been 14 British prime ministers elected in her reign. She's met, I think, 15 presidents of the United States. She'll be remembered for that discretion and neutrality that we've been talking about, and her emphasis on reconciliation and unity. I mean, for example, after the Scottish referendum, in her Christmas message, she encouraged reconciliation between the different sides. There was that visit she made to the Sandringham Women's Institute, where she, after Brexit, where she talked about listening to other people's point of view and recognizing, you know, keeping things in perspective, essentially, and recognizing there's we have more in common than we don't have. So there's sort of qualities, I think, that we see from her. I suppose, above all, I think that we will remember her personal character, her convictions, and her example, as actually was predicted by her Archbishop of Canterbury at her coronation, Sir Geoffrey Fisher, that have shaped the role of the monarchy, the modern monarchy. She didn't have a guidebook of how to proceed, but as the power of Britain has declined, the importance of the monarch's character and example, in terms of creating soft power for her, and for Britain, has increased. And she has done that so well because of who she is.
Wonderful. And Penny, how do you think she'll be remembered?
I think she will be remembered as the mother of the nation, really. You know, our lives, I mean, I go back to this change, but our life has changed so dramatically and so quickly in the last 70 years. And in the midst of all of that, we've had this one constant, to echo again, Susanna, you know, she has been there for us. She's been like an absolute rock, everything else swirling round, but she has been that same familiar face with the same calm and the same reassurance. I mean, you know, I was very taken by her address during the pandemic, when she spoke and she echoed Vera Lynn, "We will meet again." You know, there we were again, everybody's lives were up in the air. We were being locked down, our relatives were dying and suffering, and we couldn't be with them. And life felt as though, you know, it was terrible. And yet she stood up and she said, "We're all in this together. We will come through it. We will come out the other side." And, you know, had a politician stood up and said that, we wouldn't have paid any notice whatsoever, because politicians, you know, we know that they're all, forgive me, but I think that they are, you know, after the next vote, they're photo opportunities, they're constantly on the make in some way. The Queen is not. She has been there for us. When she goes to a scene of a disaster, it's not to get in the newspaper for people to see how marvelous she is. She's there because she understands that by standing shoulder to shoulder with somebody who is suffering, they feel better, they feel comforted. And that is what I think she has done absolutely magnificently for 70 years.
Very well put, both of you. Elizabeth the Dignified, I think, is probably how she'll be remembered to me. A couple of people are asking how best to celebrate the Jubilee. I'll just very quickly tell you, you can go onto the Telegraph website, you can see all the different events that are planned. There's a 4-day weekend, some celebrations in London on that weekend of June the 4th. There's going to be opportunities to see her in town. She's going to be on the balcony, I believe, on the Saturday and possibly the Sunday. You can see her at the service of Thanksgiving. Another good place to see her is at the Epsom Derby. She hopes to have a winner this year. That could be fun to watch. And come over to London. I know there's a lot of people from abroad. We've got Hamburg, we've had Bermuda, we've had USA. You're more than welcome here. Our coronavirus testing rules have been stripped back, so it's easy to travel here, so please do so. Please also keep checking the Telegraph website, because we're obviously going to be updating you with all of the latest as we get closer and closer to the time. And we hope that you can come over and celebrate with us. We're over time by 10 minutes, predictably, and I could have asked you plenty more questions. Before I go, and before I say goodbye to our wonderful guests, I just want to say that we're doing another Telegraph Live event on February the 23rd. I'm going to be interviewing Joanna Lumley, who is kind of TV royalty. She's the queen of telly. She's got a new book out, and so we're going to be together in a studio for an hour. So I think the Telegraph Live people are going to put the link for that on this chat, and we're going to put it online as well. Thoroughly looking forward to that. In the meantime, well, what can I say? How brilliant have Penny Junor and Suzannah Lipscomb been? Because I just feel that this has been extremely informative. I've learned things, and this is supposed to be my bread and butter. So I want to thank you both very much, ladies, for taking time out of your very busy schedules and sharing your thoughts with us. It's been completely enlightening. Keep subscribing to the Telegraph, keep reading royal stories, keep being interested, and thank you very much for your support, and have a great evening. Thank you.